There is currently a problem with blood donation, and that is that the supply of donated blood available is not large enough to accommodate all the sick or injured people who need blood transfusions. According to the 2007 National Blood Collection and Utilization Survey report, 38,000 donations are needed daily in the United States. This translates into over 4.5 million patients who need blood transfusions each year in the United States. However, less than 1/3 of the U.S. population that is eligible to donate blood actually does so each year, and only 37% of the U.S. population is eligible. Therefore, the goal of this model is to figure out the best way to improve the blood donation process so that more people will donate blood, and thus more blood will be available in life-threatening situations which require blood transfusions. This is a reference behavior graph of actual donors, and it shows what has happened in the past with the current level of donors, and it shows also the hope and the fear for future level of donors. The fear is that the number of donors will continue to drop, which is seen in the graph with the lower curve, while the hope is that the number of donors will increase until it reaches a steady high level, which is what we show in the hope at the top. This is also another graph. It's a behavior over time graph of the actual and potential donors. And what we did was at first we predicted that the number of potential donors would decrease inversely with an increase in actual donors, since those who are no longer potential donors are assumed to have become actual donors. However, we realized after we started doing our testing that since the U.S. population is constantly growing, more people will feed into the potential donors, and so that curve never drops as low as it does in this graph.
Okay, so this is a story about the modeling process. First, we started out with the U.S. population, with the total population and a death and birth flow into it. The percentage eligible of potential donors is calculated as 37% of the U.S. total U.S. population. The next segment that we created for the blood donation model was the donor segment. We have two major stocks, the potential donors and the actual donors. The goal of the model is to make more potential donors become actual donors. The becoming a donor flow, the rate of becoming a donor is calculated by the actual probability of becoming an actual donor, which is the normal probability of becoming an actual donor is multiplied by the effective ratio on education, which we'll explain later. Also, as Hadas described in the reference graph, the potential donors is constantly increasing by new potential donors flow, which is calculated by the new percentage that is eligible from births and deaths, and an age delay of 16 years because people can donate from the ages of 16 to 79.
This component right now shown is the blood component in the final model diagram. The stocks are actual donation, blood bank, and the amount of blood transfused, and all the stocks are in units of blood. This segment is like an aging chain in that it follows the path of blood from the donation from one person to the transfusion into another person. When blood is donated, it begins in the actual stock donation. It is then transferred to the blood banks, yet a small percentage of the blood is discarded after it is deemed unusable through the 13 tests that are performed on each unit of donated blood. From the blood bank, the blood is transfused into people with life-threatening emergencies, yet another small percentage of that blood is discarded because it spent over 42 days in the banks and is therefore expired. Once the blood is transfused into a human, it remains there.
The third segment, the third component of the blood donation model is the context component, which is part of the process of becoming an actual donor from a potential donor. Like I said before, the U.S. total population is part of the probability of meeting a potential donor, which is also calculated by the number of potential donors. To start this off, the people who receive blood and the actual donors are people who are affected by blood donation. And this number of people equal the total number of contacts per affected population per year, which is multiplied by the people affected by blood donation and the actual contacts per affected person per year. The number of contacts with potential donors then affects the rate at which potential donors become actual donors. This is our final population model with all the different components. With the blood donor component, the blood component, and the contacts component, and then finally the donors and the population components. So, the final graph is this graph right here, showing both the actual donors and the potential donors. Potential donors is the red line that's constantly increasing because the U.S. population is constantly increasing, and the actual donors models semi-convergent behavior, but is constantly increasing.
So there are two major feedback loops in our model, and both of them involve actual donors as the main stop. The first one is a reinforcing feedback loop, which means that all of a change in one factor will create a continuous change in all the other factors in the same direction. So if one factor or variable is increased, then it will compoundingly increase with no balancing effect. As it shows, an initial increase in the actual donors will cause an obvious increase in the amount of blood that is actually donated, and an increase in this will lead to an increase in the amount of blood that is available in the blood bank, which leads to an increase in the amount of blood that is able to be transfused into people who are needing emergency life-saving blood transfusions. If the amount of blood transfused increases, the people who receive blood, of course, will increase too. And that increases the people affected by blood donation, because this component, the people affected by blood donation, is the sum of people who have donated blood and people who have received blood. And so therefore an increase in one of the factors will increase the total sum. This causes an increase in the total contacts by the affected population per year. And since the whole population is composed of people, including the potential donors, an increase of contacts with the total population will also increase the number of contacts with potential donors. This will increase the rate of people becoming a donor, which in turn increases the number of actual donors. And as you will see, every single thing increases the next, and it just is a continuous cycle of increasing this.
So the second feedback loop is counteracting feedback, which shows that when one thing increases, the other component decreases. We started out with the number of actual donors and it goes through the contacts component, which fluctuates, which is based on the effective ratio on the education multiplier. And counteracting feedback is characterized by an opposite relationship between two components. In this case, as actual donors increases, the rate at which potential donors become donors decreases, which manifests the counteracting nature of the feedback. An increase in actual donors causes an increase in new donations, and therefore directly increases actual donation. An increase of actual donation enlarges the ratio of actual donors to target donations. The increase of this ratio reduces the effective ratio on education, because when there are more actual donors, there's a less urgent need for education, to educate the population. The diminishing effective ratio in education causes both the number of actual contacts per affected person per year and the number of contacts with potential donors to decrease also. Finally, as the number of contacts with potential donors decreases, the rate of becoming a donor also declines, which causes less conversion from potential to actual donors. In sum, it decreases the number of actual donors.
It's good that we have these two different feedback loops, one that is reinforcing and one that is counteracting, so that our model doesn't shift one way in the same direction continuously, but it can be balanced and stabilized with two loops that work against each other. We decided to do two major policies to see that our model was working correctly and to see how we could personally improve the process of blood donation. For one policy, we changed the normal contacts per affected person per year by increments of 4, with the first parameter value at 10 contacts per year and the fifth parameter value at 26 contacts per year. The main effect that this has on the actual donors is that it makes the initial increase of the donors less gradual and the donor level remains slightly higher. Therefore, it would be beneficial to increase the number of normal contacts per affected person per year when the need for blood transfusions is urgent and consistently high. This is what the sensitivity analysis graph looked like when we changed the contacts, and it shows that the more contacts there are, the higher the actual donor level is.
Our second policy demonstrates what would occur if there is an immediate increase in the target, which is the amount of blood ideally available, and we decreased it by 25% in the 10th year. The target affects the effect of ratio on education. An example of a realistic situation in which this could occur is if the United States entered a war in the 10th year of the simulation, and the need for blood transfusions increased in accordance with the number of injured soldiers. This graph demonstrates the counteracting feedback loop involving the effect of ratio on education converter. When the ratio of actual donations to the target decreases dramatically in the 10th year, the effect of ratio on education increases dramatically and stimulates a major increase in the education component of the model, thus also increasing the number of actual donors to reflect the change. And this graph, the graph of this policy, shows that the actual donor level will change in accordance with the target. As you can see, in the 10th year, the number of actual donors, which is the blue line, it increases dramatically, while the potential donors decreases slightly, then continues to increase.
One component that we weren't able to show in this graph is that the total population would decline if the U.S. did in fact enter a war, and so therefore the potential donors would be even lower than it is shown in this graph. What we learned from doing this model. We learned that the process of model building is a multi-step process. We continually add on components to our model and change it until it reflects what we believe to be realistic behavior. We learned how serious the issue of blood donation is. There are hundreds and hundreds of people who are waiting for blood transfusions and die before the supply of blood is large enough to accommodate them. We learned about the main reasons why people do and do not choose to donate. The major reason people choose not to donate is because they don't realize that their blood is needed. This was important to learn because it proved to us it'd be easier to convince someone to donate through education, and that's why we added an education component into our model.
We also learned how to think critically and determine what policies and ideas could lead to success in improving the blood donation process in the United States. Extrapolating from the data that we collected and the crucial role of information transfer, blood drives are efficient and effective ways of collecting blood because they encourage people to share their experiences within the community, and it consolidates collection. We also learned that one donation can save 3 lives.
So donate!